Focal length isn't just a fucking zoom. Well, actually, it kind of is, but there's like a lot of it behind it. And we need to cover this extensively so that you understand that just like for height, just like for framing, just like for any topic, you shouldn't default to a certain focal length, and you shouldn't change your focal length just because you need a little bit more things inside your frame. So what is the impact of focal length on space perception? Basically, we'll change the idea of depth, and we'll see that some focal lengths create depth while other focal lengths create like shallowness. Also this difference between distortion and natural and flat, depending on how long or short your focal length is. Also in terms of quantity of information, because depending on the focal length you can have more or less information in your image, of course. This is what people generally default to. If I need more information, I shorten my focal length and I have more stuff in my frame. This is true, but there's more stuff happening. And also in terms of immersiveness, because of how natural or not it feels, then the immersiveness will be slightly different when you're looking at the image. So different lenses and spaces, we'll have a look at 5 options that are like covering like a pretty large spectrum, and then we can have a look at what is happening in between. It doesn't matter, but we'll have a look at like 150 millimeter, 90, 50, 28, and 16 millimeter. So very long focal length all the way down to very short focal length. And we'll do 3 case scenarios where we have like an aerial view, a street level view, and an interior scenario. So let's start with this 16 millimeter aerial view. Here we have quite a bit of distortion, as you can see. Since we have our image that is like quite long, we have a lot of things that are like going all the way up to our little perspective point, which is not here, but whatever, it should be on the horizon anyway. But so you can see like very dynamic shapes. We also get, of course, a lot of context because we're so like zoomed out in a way that we get like a lot of what's happening around it. And we have, therefore, since we have a lot of context, we have a lot of depth, because it means that we have a lot of plane happening. We have this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, etc. So there's a lot of different lines or planes or stripes or whatever that are happening until our building that is actually just here. This is like our point of focus that we'll focus on and zoom in as we go. So it is quite immersive because there's like such a dynamic of like catching our eye and like sort of like making us look in there because of the strong distortion and strong diagonals. But it does feel a little bit unnatural because this is, you can tell that this is not human focal length. If we look at a 28 millimeter, this one is like way more natural looking. It's not exactly human perception. Human is like between 28 and 50. I'd say it's like around 40 or something like that. So this is still like something very natural to us. You can see we cropped out quite a lot of a thing, but we still have a pretty average amount of context. And we're a little bit better centered on our subject where we can read what's happening. 50 millimeter, this is, as I'm saying, like most human, 40 to 50, it's like really depends on people, but depends on like what type of camera you're talking about and what type of the sensor, etc. But whatever. Either way, we have like almost no distortion happening. Here you have a strong diagonal bits because of the orientation of the building, not because of the actual distortion. And this one then is, you can see again, very zoomed in on our subjects. So very natural looking, as if you were like literally looking out of the window, basically. 90 millimeters, sorry. Here you have like little context, like less and less context because we're zooming in on a very smaller area. We still have this sort of interesting aspect that the fact that it's like flattening the perspective. When you start going above 70, 80 millimeter, you really have the perspective is like going away like more and more. And here you can see that we have like this sort of nice overlap that is happening with this building that is actually very far from here. But in the fact that the perspective is completely flattened, it means that we have this nice overlap of this over our scene here. This type of focal length, let's say 70, 90, etc., is very good at overlapping objects that are like in very large distance in the actual scene, but that you can then overlap and create relationship between, because literally we're creating a relationship between this building and this building, even though in terms of distance and plan, they're very far apart. Same thing, 150. So here it's like you almost have this sort of like look of like a miniature looking. Is like if you were looking at a little model, like a train model or something like that. You have almost zero context per se, because even though, I mean, compared to what we originally had in the 16 millimeter, is like we always have like just an excerpt of the building, an excerpt of this building, and we're focusing on this area. In terms of actual size of the area, this is a very large area, but in terms of perceived area and the context, it's just a very small piece. Also, what is happening is that since we have a lot of geometric, a lot of overlapping, and a lot of in zero distortion, everything is like very simple lines. It becomes very geometric and very, very graphic, basically. And this is why it's actually very, very valuable focal length if you want to make like this type of shot, basically. Now let's do the same thing at ground level and see how it like changes a little bit. Here we're at 16 millimeters. So again, we have a lot of distortion and a lot of context because we're like going very, very wide in terms of aperture, or in terms of focal length, sorry. So we have a lot of context, we have a lot of depth. We can read like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of building before we arrive at our little building subject. So it makes it quite immersive because the fact that we have this really helps us focus on here. So it's like, you know, when you have like this sort of tunnel vision. So it's quite immersive. At the same time, it is a little bit unnatural because we can understand that it's not a natural vision for us or something that is like close to a human-like vision. 28 millimeter, more natural looking, average amount of context, a little bit better focused on our project, less distortion, etc. 50 millimeter, most human, no distortion, but you can see we lost already a lot of context. We have a little bit of overlap already between the building and our little cars, but this is pretty normal, and it's due more to the camera height than the actual focal length. Here again, 90 millimeter, almost zero context. We are starting to focus on that specific aspect, and we're like flattening the perspective, as you can see, between the overlap we're creating between this and our little cars here is like very shortened. And so we can have this sort of like very interesting overlay. And here in 150 millimeter. So like you have less this sort of miniature looking because we're not in a weird like looking height. So it still feels a little bit natural, but still we have like very strong lines. And since everything is flattened, you don't have things going in every direction. You don't have any context, sorry. And everything becomes very geometric and graphic, which is definitely something worth exploring if this is what you're after. Now for the interspace, a 16 millimeter. Since interspace are a little bit like smaller, we tend to work with smaller focal length, but we can still use the whole range of the focal length in an interesting way. So 16 millimeter, you have a lot of distortion happening. You have the whole context of the building, or like the space at least. We have what we would call like an establishing shot. Have a lot of depth, very immersive, a little bit unnatural, even though here it's actually okay. But if we were like doing it a vertical way, we'd have a lot of weird diagonals, I think. 28 millimeter, a little bit more natural, something you would see if you were standing in that lobby. Emphasizes quite a lot the space, average amount of context, pretty natural looking, and very, yeah, like you can focus on the space. 50 millimeter, a bit closer to human eye, or like middle bit above, I'd say. No distortion, like the relationship with the thing is like very natural in terms of distance. And yeah, nothing more to say. 90 millimeter is like already we're in this sort of like photographic aspect where this is not something you will experience in terms of like natural viewer. So you have like almost no context, focus on a specific aspect. So this area, it starts to flatten the perspective. You can see that the overlap is like getting shorter and shorter and flatter and flatter. And you can sort of like overlay several planes, etc. 150 millimeter, still focusing on this one. You can see that we're very far from it, but that we are flattening everything. So we're starting to have a lot of overlap between the elements, which is quite nice, and everything becomes like way more geometric. Like this like curved wall, which was like very curved initially, is like now perceived as something like a little bit flatter, etc. So this is our thing, is like you can see that we can play around from 16, 18 to 150 millimeter in an indoor scenario. Of course, here we're dealing with a very large space. If you were dealing with a bathroom or whatever, it would be quite different. But this is still like options that are worth exploring. So how do you choose your focal length, basically? I think the main thing to start with is like the intent regarding how to depict the space. Is it like, how do you want it to be perceived? Do you want it to look wide? Do you want it to look flat? Do you want it to look like immersive or not, etc.? Just as you've seen, the types of focal length that you have will completely change the relationships between elements within that space. So if you're creating overlaps or not. It also depends on the amount of distortion you're willing to go to. If you can want distortion if you want something to look more dynamic, this is completely fine. If on the other hand, you want something to look natural, you know that there are some focal length that will not work. Also, you have to deal with the relationship between different planes. If you are using like short focal length, it will put distance in between the planes. If you're using longer focal length, it will overlap them and make them relate more. So this is like depending on how you want to show and depict those relationships, you will need to focus more on a certain type of focal length or another type. Last and not least, of course, is the physical constraints. You can't like make a 300 millimeter shot if you have like just 3 meters of space behind you. So this is something you need to have in mind. Of course, the thing is, normally everything will like work together. It's very rare that you want to have very long focal length on something where you really have zero space to take the image. Normally like a 50 millimeter or 90 millimeter will be enough if you want to do like a close up or whatever. So, and the thing again, regarding physical constraints is that is nice with us in terms of 3D environment is that you can use like clipping planes and stuff like this in order to potentially put yourself outside of the space. But we'll deal with that in just a second. Another thing that is interesting when it comes to focal length is that it changes our relationship to transparency. Here we have a series of columns and we call like the base conditions. So we're looking at the image and we can see there's quite a very quick overlap and there's no transparency that is very legible. We understand that there's space in between the columns, but we don't really experience the transparency that comes with it. Here are 3 options that are interesting. We're slightly moving on the left, and then we're experimenting, with 3 different focal lengths. We have 25 millimeter, 45 millimeter, and 150 millimeter. And as you can see, these are like completely different feelings. Like the 25 millimeters looks super weird, but it can be interesting maybe if you like want something very dynamic and you want to really show the transparency in between the columns. The 45 millimeter is the most natural one, and you can see that you have like space in between the columns, and you can still get like natural feeling in terms of distortion. And you can even go up until 150 millimeter. Of course, your camera is in different locations, but I'm just showing that you can show the exact same thing within the frame in terms of limits, but actually have completely different relationships with the curtain wall behind in glass and the columns in between and the spacing between the columns. Just to show you that like, depending on how much transparency you're looking for, and depending on how you want to depict the relationship between the columns, you can go with like completely different, like literally we're going from 25 to 150 millimeters. So it's completely different perceptions and completely different focal length. And yet all of these scenarios, except maybe the 25, I'm not really happy. Like, I don't really like how it looks because it's very distorted, but all of those are like potential interesting options as a base for the framing. Then you would need to work on the rest, but this is like framing stuff. Same frame borders, but different amount of information within the borders. Now, another thing that is really happening quite often, I'd say, or at least something that artists are very often complaining about, is this idea of, can you show more? You show an image to your client, oh, it's very nice, but can we enlarge it a little and see this and that? In the end, what you end up is having a 5 millimeter lens, and you're like, yeah, well, maybe this is not really doing justice to the space. So how can we deal with that? And to deal with that, we'll deal with what we call clipping planes, which is like a feature that lets you basically be outside of the space, put a clipping plane, and still see inside of the space. So here we have the base element, like the base scenario where we have this nice image, but it's the client is happy, but I think there's like more, because there's a corridor on the right. So I would like to see that corridor. Okay. So what I'll do is like, I'll just use like a very wide lens. And what it does is that there's more information, it's more spacious, but it looks very unnatural because we know that actually here is like the end of my apartment. And also we have like very strong distortion, like especially like these ones. And like, you can tell that it's not a natural looking, and you can tell that, or expect that if you actually visit that space, it will feel much, much, much smaller. So what are our options? First options is to use a clipping plane. So as I said, we have like our wall, we have our little scene with the 2 things. And instead of being here, we're going to go here. I think the mistake that people generally do is to keep a very wide lens when they're doing it. And what it does is that basically we're seeing that element here, and we're feeling that we're outside of the space. This becomes especially visible when sometimes they do like a series and you have another view from here looking towards us, and you can see that actually the wall is very like super near here and that there's no way that the camera could have sit there. So what you want in order to avoid this is to avoid having what I call this theater effect, where basically you feel like you're looking at a scene from outside. What you want is to use the technological thing that lets us do this, but at the same time make it feel natural so that you're not like completely lying to your subject or lying to your viewer. So in order to do this, what you do is to use a natural lens, but put basically, instead of being here and use a wide lens, you put like a more natural lens and you put yourself like outside and you crop a little the down part because you don't want to see that you're outside of the building or outside of the space at least. But you can see that we're almost using the same borders in terms of framing. So we have the same amount of information. It does look more spacious than at the beginning, but we have no like a natural distortion. We have like very natural distortion and we feel like we're actually inside the building. And here is a comparison between the three options where we have the final one here and the two options here. You can see the first one, as we were explaining at the very beginning, that you're getting a lot of distortion and something very unnatural looking if you compare it to how more natural the sort of distortion that we have here is feeling. And if you compare it here in terms of this sort of like theater aspect that I was talking about, you can see that here you don't have this aspect because you're really inside the space, whereas here you were feeling being outside of the space because you have some elements that really put you outside of the frame. In terms of information and quantity of information, though, you can see that we are covering more or less the same amount of information. We could actually like here expand it here a little bit without changing too much perception. And so we would have the connection with the bedroom at the end. We would have like the explanation of how is the sort of living room working, and we would have like other aspects of details that are happening. Of course, there are like some sort of like in-betweens that can happen if you want to still emphasize a little with a sort of like short focal length. But at the same time, this is something I would be very like conservative with in order to really not finish with this sort of feel where literally as soon as you have another image of that space, say from here looking toward us, you will see that the space is completely distorted and you feel like this photograph or rendering was completely fake, because then you'll see like the wall that we actually were cutting through, or that the fact that we had like a very short focal length. So this is something to be thinking about when you're creating a series of a small space, is to make sure that they all give you the same sensation of space and there's no some complete discrepancy between one shot and another. How to minimize distortion with short focal length. So this is something that is still doable if you ever want to have short focal length. So what you want to do first is to avoid objects in the edges, because we know that distortion increases as we sort of like get closer to the edge of our frame. So what you want is to make sure that either you don't put objects, or if you have objects, you put them in a way that the distortion is minimized. One thing that you can do if you really want to cheat is to actually deform the object in 3D so that the object doesn't look deformed because of the focal length. But this is like very like the last resort trick that I would go to. Another aspect that you want is to avoid having a foreground. Something that you can notice very easily when you're looking at like landscape images is that since there's almost always an absence of foreground, like very simple foreground, we almost can't read the distortion that is happening in the foreground, and the rest is actually looking very normal because it's like so much in the distance. So if you want to use like very short focal length, you can do it like you can do, but just make sure that you have a very minimal foreground or even no foreground at all, which can really help. And one final thing that is very easy to do and that is very like intuitive is to just shoot frontal. Of course, this can sort of like go against the idea of here I'm really saying if you want to minimize distortion. Of course, if you want to maximize distortion, you basically do the opposite of what I'm saying. And sometimes it will make sense that you want to increase distortion because you want your building to look very dynamic. But if you want to minimize distortion and you still need a short focal length, then the idea is to take your project and to shoot frontally and sort of correct the perspective with the different aspects of tilt and shifting that you have in your camera, so that you make sure that the plane that you're reading is very like non-distorted. And that's pretty much it regarding short focal length and how to treat them to minimize distortion.